Welcome. We are back in the 17th century. Thank goodness. Uh, Bob Goss. All right. We're back in the 17th century. And last, on Tuesday, we talked about how the Protestant Reformation changed England. And we talked about the English Civil War. So, could somebody briefly explain how the Protestant Reformation changes England? What happens in England during the English Civil War? What are the two sides in the English Civil War, and what do they do to each other? What are the just refreshing what we did on Tuesday? Cut off Charles I's head. Okay, right. Cavaliers versus Puritans. Right. Cavaliers and Protestants. Right. Puritans and Cavaliers. Okay. And so the Cavaliers are basically Anglicans, right? So they're not Catholics. They support the Anglican Church. But according to the Puritans, those Anglicans are just as bad as Catholics. You know, they have the Book of Common Prayer. The ministers look just like priests. Um, the Basically the Reformation, according to those Puritans, is not really hit, and so the Cavaliers are close to the king. They're also close to the Anglican Church. Bite and pepper. My seventh great grandfather may have cut off someone's head. The jury is still out. Okay. And so Charles I is executed. He loses his head. Puritans are Protestants, right? But the Puritans, um, they don't like Catholics, but they also don't like Anglicans. They don't like Anglicans because they believe that Anglicans are that Anglicans are just as bad as Catholics. So when we look at a Cavalier is not going to be Catholic. A Cavalier is going to be Anglican and devoted to kind of keep maintaining the old order. Okay, so what we see basically is a civil war in Britain, a sort of social collapse, an army moving through the city, through the country, and then winning back Ireland and Scotland into England, but at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. Anglicans are very much like Episcopalians, and in fact, I think the Anglican Church is the British version of the Episcopalian Church. Anglicans or Catholics are similar, but not the same. Anglicans read the Bible in English, but they do have a priest hierarchy that looks a little bit like the Catholic Church. Yeah, that's great. Catholic light. Anglicans are Catholic light. Right? They don't have a pope, but they have the hierarchy. They have confession. They have things that make them look like the Catholic Church, if that makes sense. But they're not entirely Catholic. Okay, that's clear. So it's a war between, in a way, it's a war between Protestants. One are very very kind of limited Protestants, the Anglicans, and the other are super Protestants, the Puritans. And that war, that English Civil War, is important for understanding the period that we're looking at because these people who are going to be refugees from this conflict before the execution of Charles I, during the execution of Charles I, after the execution, and then after Charles II comes back to power, different folks are going to be escaping from this conflict. And the places that they're going to go are northern and southern colonies. People that tended to favor the Puritans ended up going north, and people that tended to favor the crown ended up going south. Um, Yeah, that's more or less the case. And then now to a certain extent, those people who go to I call them the English 1% that end up in places like Carolina and Georgia and Virginia. Those people then are also bringing with them children from orphanages, kidnapped children, lots and lots of indentured servants, lots of prisoners to do their work for them. People who favor the Puritans go north. The more Protestant you are, the more likely you are to settle north. The more Anglican you are, the more you support Old England, the more you support the land of kings and things like that, the more likely you are to end up in the South. Okay, this is for white people. And this is largely what we're talking about. There are 4,000 or 5,000 Africans that are brought to the New World, to North America in this period, but the largest African migration is going to come a little later. The place that Catholics settle initially, that's a good question. There are Catholics in the north. The place that Catholics settle initially are in Maryland, which is a Catholic colony, which is a sort of, splits the difference between North and South. They go there for religious freedom because the Anglican Church, they don't want to be told what to do by the Anglican Church or told what to do by the Puritan Church, so they settle in Maryland. And then there's some that go to New Jersey and New York because New Jersey and New York promise religious freedom. New England doesn't really promise religious freedom. New England promises religious freedom if you're a Puritan or if you're a Protestant or if you believe in transubstantiation or if you or don't believe in transubstantiation. So the New Englanders are much more of a kind of Protestant area. But yeah, there are Catholics that settle in Maryland in particular and in New Jersey. And in fact, so I taught at William and Mary, which is named after King William and Queen Mary, but it had lots and lots of Catholic students because for whatever reason there were good Catholic schools in Maryland and Northern Virginia, and so for even though William and Mary themselves were Protestant kings and queens, they had mostly Catholic students in the university eventually. Okay, Bill Barr. Actually, our former Attorney General is his Watergate USA has his daughter went to William and Mary, so it was a place where lots of Catholics sent their kids. Okay, so northern colonies tend to attack Puritans and Pilgrims. Southern colonies were attracted to Loyalists. Okay. Oh, really? That's a beautiful place. We'll talk about Wren Chapel actually and sort of what Anglican classes are going to be. No, that's fine. Quizzes are going to be matching. So you can have probably 5 terms on the left and then 5 sentences on the right, and you're going to match the term to the sentence. So once you've identified 2 or 3 of them for sure, then you'll be easier to figure out the others. So you'll have a list of 5 terms and then a list of 5 sentences on the right. But it should be very easy, I would say. Okay. It should be at the end of class. That's a very good chance it'll be at the end of this class. Since I was slow to roll these quizzes out, I was having some technical difficulties. The quiz is going to be on ELC, and you'll have about 10 or 15 minutes to read on ELC. Okay. All right. Okay, so that's where we are. That with the quizzes that will be taking place soon. So let's talk about this. We talked some about the southern colonies. We talked about how the people who settled in this region, in the Virginia, as the Virginia 1%, the people who are connected to the crown. The southern white 70% are indentured servants of many kinds, or basically orphanages, kids from orphanages and things like that. The social order that we saw is basically like this, right? It's chaos. It's violence. There are a lot of people, beating each other up, shooting each other, things like that. Now you might think, well, that was the 1600s. Why do we care about the 1600s? All right. Well, let's look at the average murder rate today. Well, this is 2018 actually, but relatively recently. Look at the average murder rate today. And what you'll see, this is not, when we're thinking about murder, we should recognize that most murders in the United States are not, are to people that you know. The person that is, if you are murdered in the United States, it's very, very likely that the person that murders you is someone that you know. Right? So the murder rate in the South is less, but it's still comparable to the murder rate in the 17th century. All right? This is the South. This is a region of violence, of tremendous violence. And this is even before we see widespread Atlantic slavery. It's a kind of chaotic world, mostly settled by young men, right? And it's this world that's where we see Bacon's Rebellion. Okay, it's in this world where we see Thomas, is it Lord Bacon? What is his name? Nathaniel, thank you. Nathaniel Bacon. He, along with other servants, get frustrated and disorderly. They want to fight the Indians in the West. Nathaniel, right. And they led planners to rethink their fondness for white servants. And in it, the militiamen, basically Berkeley proposes establishing forts and stopping westward settlement. The spoiled son of a landlord, Nathaniel Bacon, leads a militia of servants and small farmers. And he prepares all-out war against the Indians, and he orders the governor arrested. In turn, the governor captures him and hangs people associated with Bacon, 23 men in all. The king recalls Berkeley and signs treaties with the Indians. Okay. So and then we talked about how after 1675, people started to think about slavery, African slavery. African slavery existed for 50 years in the Caribbean, and it was relatively, it was a different, there were relatively few people who were slaves for life in Virginia in, say, the 1620s or the 1630s. But by 1675, the southern mainland colonies start to bring over African slaves. Now I want to talk about that. So this is the world of the Cavalier, right? The Cavalier is a small group of people that ultimately lead to a kind of chaos and dissent. Now I want to talk about the Puritans. My advisor was one of my advisors was a Southern historian, and he said that we never really need to care about the Puritans because there were only like 10 of them. There are actually more books about Puritans now than there were Puritans. That's true, but there were this was a sort of a community that was able to reproduce itself relatively quickly, and that's important if you want to talk about colonization. So Puritans, they opposed religious political authority, opposed the established political authority, and believed in predestination. And then there were also the Pilgrims who wanted to separate themselves entirely. And so if you think about, remember that Plymouth is the separating Pilgrims, the Pilgrims who wanted to separate themselves, whereas Massachusetts was the reforming Puritans. They wanted to purify the Church of England, purify the Anglican Church. Their duty was to assess the state of their own souls, and as a result, they devoted themselves to self-examination and Bible study. Yes, you should get the scores as soon as you submit them, but I can't, this is a work in progress because I've never used ELC to do quizzes before. So this may be chaos. We'll see. Self-examination and Bible study, and families pray together each day under the guidance of the husband and father. Since whole families and even whole villages migrated to the New England colonies, men and women came in fairly equal numbers, as you can see just in this image here. They didn't face the kind of demographic imbalance that troubled southern colonies and the Puritan population. Sorry, I don't mean to scare you. I don't think you mean that the Puritans are scary. I think you mean that it's scary that I've never done a quiz on ELC before. Yeah, if everything goes totally haywire, then I'll just create another quiz and we'll call this one a dry run. But I think this should work. Moreover, New England's climate was much healthier than that of southern colonies, and this is weird. Yes, the Puritans were in the north. Oh, I see. Got it. New England's climate in basically what we would call, it's Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. That's New England. Basically the colonies to the north. Yeah, we'll see. Once the colonists got past the first 2 or 3 years and established self-sufficient farms, you won't see the quiz until I make it available to you. New England proved to be healthier than England. Thus, an Englishman could expect to live 50 to 55 years. If he emigrated to the Chesapeake or the South, he would lose 10 years off his life expectancy. If he settled in New England, he gained 10 years. Okay? This is astonishing. This is a huge difference in mortality rates, right? So mortality rates go down 10 years for English people who settle in the South, and they go up 10 years for people who settle in New England. So why? There's some explanations. We can't. This demographic change is really important and really explains sort of why the sort of New England is successful. Some examples for this. Yeah, you've got disease and a large population in England at the time. And so people are drinking water with other people's urine in it and fecal matter and stuff in it. So there's a good chance of dying from, a whole bunch of communicable diseases. Yeah. Sorry, didn't mean to go so over the top there. Yeah, no, the drinking water was not that easily separated from the water that you would get, basically where people were relieving themselves. Yeah, but importantly, mosquitoes can't take the humidity, the heat, the cold, and so the cold is what kills mosquitoes, and mosquitoes which are responsible for delivering many of the diseases that kill people in the South. That sounds right. Yes. When I get done with the lecture. I'm sorry. Maybe I just go there. I have a tendency to go there. Okay, so some explanations. Close-knit colonies where children were quickly farmed out to other families if parents died. If this is one of the funny things about the people trying to do genealogy in the 18th century is that if a mother and father died, the child would be quickly turned over to another family and basically apprenticed to that family and survive. But they would quickly be adopted by these other people. So actually drawing genetic chains through the New England migrants is really, really hard because kids are often see their parents, if their parents die, they get farmed out to others. Yeah, it could lead to awkward family dinners. So lots of stepfathers, lots of stepmothers in New England. The winter killed disease-carrying mosquitoes. The high literacy rate, based on Bible reading, right? Everyone had to read the Bible in their own language. That was the expectation of a Puritan or a Protestant, meant that you had better medical care by midwives and others. So that midwives were many of the doctors in these regions, and they had better medical care. So women were more likely to live through childbirth in New England than in the South. Yeah, we don't know for sure. We just know that it was a massive difference. A massive difference. Okay. That meant New England families were bigger, more stable, and long-lived. In New England, most men were able to marry, and marriages lasted longer and produced more children who are more likely to live to maturity. So marriage rates, people get married younger in New England than they did in England. And in England, you had to wait if you were a man, you had to wait until you had a fortune or something like that, a few £100. In New England, that's not as necessary because the community is supporting you. And in effect, New England creates grandparents. So for people in England, kids who were born rarely met their grandparents. The grandparents were dead by the time they were, 4 or 5 years old. But New England creates grandparents, and so that people have more, a relationship with not just their father and mother, but their grandfathers and grandmothers. Family control then was very important In New England, parents live long enough to exert a tremendous amount of control over their adult children. So this is the little bit of a darker side of this. Men couldn't marry without land to cultivate, and they couldn't get land except from their fathers. And so there was a tremendous amount of authority and power that fathers had. But this also meant that there was less violent crime. It meant that there was less chaos. It meant that there was less regular violence. Okay, there were tighter integration between the New England colonies and Indians and Native people. New England colonists tried harder to mesh Indian and European traditions. And this is, syncretic religion is not available here, right? Syncretic religion where you say, oh, that you worship that tree, we're going to call that, you know, Saint Ignatius and create a saint's day after him. The Protestants were not, the Puritans were not about all that. Like, no, 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 we are not going to accept the old religion. You have to worship Christ. You have to do that by reading the Bible in your own language. The first Bible published in the United States, first Bible published in North America, 1663, is a Bible in the language of Massachusetts Indians that John Eliot produces. So they are serious about training people in the Bible as it's translated in the language that people understood. And this took a tremendous amount of work on the part of the New England colonists, to give them credit. They really did try to evangelize people without just simply dumping them in water and calling them saved. They didn't have this syncretic tradition. Pilgrims and Quakers hated objects, and instead they turned to praying towns, right, of the Massachusetts, the Narragansetts, and some of the Wampanoags. The first Bible published in the United States, as I said, or in British North America, is this translation of the King James Bible into Massachusetts. There's a drastic demographic change then before 1675 and before King Philip's War. So King Philip's War is 1675. By 1675, the English population in New York is 50,000. Okay, that's a massive number compared to the French colonies, compared to the Spanish colonies and elsewhere. The English population in New England is 50,000, while the indigenous population goes from 140,000 in New England to something like 20,000. Okay, so their population is, and this is not New Englanders killing people. This is mostly communicable diseases. Yeah, sorry, maybe a little bit of, I might have messed up the shrinking and drawing of him. You know, when you copy images, you're trying not to make them too narrow or wide, but sometimes you mess up the proportions. But this is King Philip, the Wampanoag chief. The Indian opposition to these praying towns was King Philip, also called Metacom. After the colonists hung 3 Wampanoags in 1675, Metacom organizes Wampanoags and others to raid and attack villages in Massachusetts. And the Wampanoags, as you can see, are over here in this part of New England. Yeah, to me, it may well be the image itself. That, I think, is Paul Revere's image of King Philip. And Paul Revere was living in the 1770s. Wampanoag was living in the 1670s. So it's not clear exactly what the source for this was. Oh, sorry. You can't see where I'm pointing? Okay. Oh, yeah, let me, bear with me here for a second. I'll move this over. Okay. So the Wampanoags are here. Can you see my cursor there? And so he organizes initially the Wampanoags, and then others like the Nipmucs and the Pocumtucks. On the side of the New Englanders are the Mohicans and the Pequots. My sixth great grandmother was Mohegan. And the Mohicans were favored the New England colonies over the other people. So the English population, let me go down. I've got an image. That's a good question. So this is before the 1675. The English population is about 52,000 in New England. The Native American population is about 20,000. and who hung who. And so, yeah, so initially what happens is the colonists hang 3 Wampanoags in 1675. Metacom says, this is not your responsibility. Like, these people may have committed a crime, but they can only be punished by Wampanoags. This is unacceptable. He organizes raids that attack villages in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maine. And to give you a sense of this, this is where the major battles take place. This is Metacom, or King Philip, M-E-T-A, sorry. He was christened. He was christened with the name Philip, but his name was most often pronounced or spelled as Metacom in the Wampanoag language. Okay, and so there are these raids that then take place under King Philip throughout New England. Raids in which whole communities are burned to the ground, including, well, where are we? My New England geography is not fantastic here, but there are a whole bunch of towns that are basically almost wiped out by Wampanoag's men. And they engage then in warfare. And this is where the English Civil War comes in again. Okay? Remember that the English Civil War is the 1640s. Remember that lots of people involved in the English Civil War escape in the 1650s and the 1660s to the New World. Why? Because when Charles II is going to come back to power, he's going to prosecute anyone who contributed to the death of Charles I, right? So what you have in New England in the 1660s is a whole bunch of not just Puritans, but armed Puritans who've been involved in lots of these campaigns against the Irish, against the Scottish. You have highly skilled soldiers. That's not most of them, but enough to run 2 or 3 companies of soldiers, militia soldiers who otherwise are rather pretty crappy militia. You know, they don't much know how to shoot. They don't much know how to fight, but they're led by people who were in the New Model Army. They're led by people who are used to not just effective warfare, but genocidal warfare, right? Of wiping out communities. And this is what happens in King Philip's War, is basically an almost genocidal warfare. 15% of the Native American population is wiped out in King Philip's War in response to the burning of these villages. By comparison, the English lose 1.5%. That doesn't sound like much, but it's the biggest demographic, it's the biggest loss in sort of British forces, you know, sort of new white colonist forces of any war ever, right? So if we look at U.S. casualties in the American Civil War, it's 800 per 100,000, or 1 in 1,000. Little less than 1 in 1,000 people dies in the American Civil War. A little less than 2 in, or 0.2 in 1,000 die in World War II. 1,500 in 100,000. So about 1.5% of the population is wiped out. Of the British population is wiped out in this war. So it's very, very high casualties for them, but it's nothing like the casualties for the Native Americans, which are basically genocidal scale. You've heard this term decimation? Decimation? Decimation means to lose 10% of your population, right? Decimation. When you say decimation, you mean that's terrible catastrophe, because decimal, right? It was 1/10. This is more than decimation. This is decimation and a half for the New England Native Americans in King Philip's War. This is just wiping out whole communities, whole groups of languages, whole towns as a result of this King Philip's War. This lasts about 6 months. It starts with a few raids on towns in Massachusetts and Connecticut, so, a torture of some colonists, and then the response by the New England militia that just goes on a rampage and kills lots and lots of Native Americans. They kill over 15%. much like against the Irish in Drogheda and Wexford. They kill those that surrender. And so there are these stories about people who, colonists who are right. There are these stories about colonists who are in a church and they are surrounded by Wampanoags, and the Wampanoags are threatening to burn the church down. And somebody gets up, and it turns out he was one of the people who's over 15% of the Native Americans in New England. One of the colonists gets up and says, "I've seen this kind of battle before. This is Goss, Gosse. I've seen this kind of battle before. We will organize in formation." And he gets the people in the church to organize in formation. Only a few of them have guns, and they hold off the sort of Wampanoags that are attacking them, and then they kill them. They kill them all. Yes, so 15% of Native Americans are killed in King Philip's War. This is really only an estimate. We can't say for sure. It could be more than that. It's decimation and a half, right? Okay, so this is what a New England colony looks like. And this is part of the reason that they grow so quickly. Is, yeah, some of them did bring guns to church, right? Yeah, as one does. The colony's method of distributing land helped to further this communal ideal. Unlike in the Chesapeake, in the colonies of the lower South, where individual applicants got head rights for themselves and their servants, in Massachusetts, groups of people, often from the same part of England, applied together to the general court for grants of land on which to establish towns. In fact, they often, in their organization, copied the villages from which they came. They laid out town lots for houses and a church. They gave each family that's a disturbing church. I might have grown up in a church like that in Sanford, Florida. They laid out town lots for houses and a church. They even gave each family parcels of land scattered around. Sorry, they gave each family parcels of land scattered around the town center. And so you can see. But the town center was the key. That was the town hall. That was the place where things were discussed. That was where the village green was where the militia organized. And they organized in a new way, right? In a way like the New Model Army. They were all educated. They were all literate. They could be much more effective than a kind of the militias of the 10th or 11th or 12th century Europe. These were literate militias, which were much more powerful. They also reserved the best and largest plots for the most distinguished people among them. People who had been low on the social scale in England were given the smallest and least desirable plots. I have lots of family stories to share. I had the one drunkard who came over on the Mayflower in my family, and he drank so much and got in so much trouble that they tied him to a stake, and they tied his ankle to his neck for an entire day. So he got the smallest plot on the Mayflower when he landed from the Mayflower when he landed. Yeah, I can't really imagine how you do that. Puritans in Massachusetts were given a corporate charter from King Charles in 1629. Oh yeah, well, so, I've got I had some grandfather who cared a lot about genealogy, and then other folks, and then just on my own, I was able to look this stuff up. So they used a loophole in the charter to change the base of the company from England to Massachusetts. So there was a Massachusetts company, but Charles I had granted to them, but the colonists just sort of took it over. The governor and advisors changed the Massachusetts company to an elected body, chosen by household heads who were in the church. Yes, yes. Right. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I've got more stories. I'm also descended from Mahershala Balaz Nelson, whose servant cut off his head and was buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Because these communities were compact, social behavior could be closely monitored. Yeah, that's true. The Puritan law book was the Bible. In other words, crime and sin were the same. Behavior was so strictly controlled in these small communities that few violent crimes or property crimes ever occurred. Oh, wow. All right. That left Puritan courts with the luxury of spending their time prosecuting breaches of moral law. For example, the New Haven colony prosecuted few people for assaults or property crimes, and not one person for murder in the entire history of the Massachusetts colony. It concentrated instead on moral crimes, particularly fornication, adultery, sodomy, buggery, and public masturbation. And you see this kind of stuff is what you see in the record books of New England. Yeah, right. One man was executed for public masturbation, another for attempted sodomy. Yeah, I've noticed some people confessed to sodomy. One person confessed to sodomy with a horse, two goats, and a turkey, and was ultimately prosecuted for this. Make that. I'm not really sure how that, but it relied on a confession. This is also the Scarlet Letter, right? The story of the Scarlet Letter comes from this. Um, I don't know. The Scarlet Letter, the character comes in. She's an adulteress. She has a child. She won't name the father. The father is the minister, and she has to walk around with a Scarlet Letter on her chest. This is the Puritans. Uh, okay, I'm not sure what. So this is what the Puritans do. They dunk witches. They prosecute moral crimes, including adultery and things like that. But they are also prosecuting sodomy and buggery. Um, okay. The economy. New England was harsh in its treatment of colonists. It considered sinners and harsh in other ways as well. The field of New England produced grain and stones, mostly stones. It was only with some difficulty the colonists in New England were able to feed themselves. I'm not going to answer that. You have to look it up. Um, and even the small surplus of grains that they eventually produced never became a valuable staple export. England had its own grain, so New Englanders couldn't produce any grain that England wanted. Um, New Englanders caught fish, but England was an island. It had its own fish. New Englanders were able to export furs. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Well, you made me look up e-boys, so it's your fault. I'm sorry. New Englanders were able to export furs for a while, but eventually the local supply was quickly exhausted, and the French and the Dutch blocked efforts to tap more distant sources. By 1675, the New England fur trade was dead. Okay, so New England colonies lacked a major staple commodity. They needed to import countless things from abroad. Tools, seed, livestock, and clothing. And even when particular colonists found opportunities to accumulate wealth, they would find themselves constrained by the association of profit with excess, which was a sin. So Puritan communities, like the English villages from which they came from, were moral economies. Let me just write that down. Moral economies is a term you'll come across fairly often. A moral economy is one that regulates prices. It capped profits and frowned on anyone who upset the stability of the community by profiting off neighbors. Dunking, yes. Labor becomes family members and neighbors. And it works. With a short growing season, because of the cold and small farms, family labor was adequate. Moral economy was both in England and in New England. And it was basically to say, bread is, a shilling a loaf, or, 5 shillings a loaf. If you charge 6 shillings a loaf or 8 shillings a loaf for your bread, you are, a usurer and can be hanged, right, for charging too much for your food. I have another relative. I have lots of relatives. This is on my mother's side, who had false bottoms in his mugs. He ran a tavern, and the whole community gathered around and hanged him and killed him. That's moral economy, where you have a set price and a set size for goods, and if you violate that, you get killed. Not killed, but shunned or jailed or possibly killed. People took their drink very seriously. Okay, colonists hoped to convert Indians who might then help Puritans and Pilgrims settle. They imagined Indians killing off the dangerous wolves and bears, uh, allowing people to expand west. The thing that ultimately helps northern colonies survive is by providing rum, wood, and ships, and then insurance for the West Indian colonies. In order of importance to England, as we said before, the most important colonies to England are the Caribbean. Um, they're down here. Next in line is these places, which can provide food for the Caribbean colonies. And finally is New England, which is less valuable and suited for dumping all your dissenters and critics and people who believe in, have different religious traditions. So, what's going to make New England rich? What's going to make New England rich is the slave trade. New England is not going to be directly involved in the slave trade in the sense that relatively few enslaved Africans are going to be brought to New England. But the people who are going to do that trade, who are going to engage on that trade and becoming wealthy in that trade, are going to be New Englanders, ultimately. In northern colonies, which were much less valuable to England. Many refugees were attracted to a commonwealth, to a sense of godliness, also a sense of self-righteousness that could sometimes ease into a sort of genocidal attack on other people. Okay, let's step back a little bit. In the Aztec, Maya, and Inca societies, there was a large Creole population of mixed ancestry. There is less of that in the Americas, partly because the native societies of North America are more mobile, they resist enslavement, and they escape. But also, Portuguese and Spanish settlement was sponsored by the crown and organized to suit the crown. The chaos of the English Civil War in the middle of the settlement of the 1600s meant that refugees from one side or the other ended up in the New World. The Anglican Cavaliers escaped to the south, where they would party and pay for slaves to do their work and pay for brides from England when they could afford to buy them. The Puritan Roundheads escaped to the north as men and women, where they tried to create a Puritan society where they could practice their religion freely and also prevent anyone else from practicing a religion that differed slightly, splinter off and go to Boston or Rhode Island or New Haven. They would found very different societies, north and south. The Creole population was in basically Brazil and Mexico. So basically where the Spanish and the Portuguese colonies are, and to a certain extent the French colonies in what becomes Canada. They do try to proselytize to the Indians. They do convert them. When that fails, though, as it does spectacularly in 1675 in King Philip's War, their response to the burning and destruction is close to wholesale slaughter, decimation and a half. So there's no syncretism directly, but there is an intermingling of traditions about food, planting, and settlement, though it's often invisible to us. We should recognize that if the Native Americans weren't there, that New England probably never would have been settled. That many of the things that you see in a New England kitchen in the 1660s and 1670s are borrowed in one way or another from Native communities. The drying of gourds and others, the sort of methods of using and preparing corn, all of the food that's made from corn. Benjamin Franklin famously ate nothing but corn. And he thought, and bread didn't agree with him. And he tried to persuade British people that they should eat corn because it was so much cheaper and so much better. He drank corn whiskey. Most of the food that he ate was corn. They are a kind of corn-eating people, and in that sense, weirdly, there is some sort of syncretism there. There is some sort of absorption of native traditions by these Puritans and Pilgrims. But it's still at the same time. Ultimately, they're going to be very separate communities. Okay, and that's the North and the South. The English Civil War then produces two very separate communities, going in two very separate ways, having two very separate demographies, and that those tensions are going to be explode, of course, 200 years later in the American Civil War. Ultimately, though, the enslavement of Africans which is going to come in large part after 1675, is going to profit both northern and southern colonies, but in direct and indirect ways. The way in which New England is going to benefit is largely through the trade, because New England is going to be a large group of people who are engaged in Atlantic trade, and they're the ones who are going to help make possible the Atlantic slave trade.